Hey guys, Mr. Balma here. Good afternoon and happy Tuesday. So today I'm going to read to you chapter 11 of the narrative of the life and death of Frederick Douglass. I feel like with everything going on in the world, um, it is good that we as a class are reading this, and I'll talk more about this later because I really want to hear what Frederick has to say. But um, I hope you all are doing well, and if you guys have any questions on anything that's going on in the world right now, especially because as we talk about this, um, I'm sure there's going to be conversations about race and what's going on today and what we can do. So reach out to me. I'd be happy to talk to you about it. I love you guys. I miss you. I hope you're safe. And here are today's questions. So today there are quite a few questions, but it's the last chapter, so it's okay. For what two reasons does Frederick tell us that he cannot relate the means of his escape? Why does he not approve of the Underground Railroad? What does Master Hugh, do to attempt to encourage Frederick to continue to earn money? What effect does this encouragement have? What does Frederick ask of Master Thomas? What is he told? What arrangement does Frederick eventually make with Mr. Hugh? Why is this arrangement to Mr. Hugh's advantage? Why does Frederick agree to it? What does Mr. Hugh do when he discovers that Frederick has left town to find work? Why does Frederick decide to work hard despite the dissolution of their agreement? When and where does Frederick run away? Why does he feel so lonely? Who helps Frederick in New York? How? How is it possible for Frederick and Ahna to marry? Why is their marriage such an important event? Why does Mr. Ruggles suggest that Frederick not stay in New York and go to New Bedford, Massachusetts? Who helps Frederick and Ahna in New Bedford? What does he do for them? Why did Frederick change his name so many times? Who chooses Douglas? Why? What had Douglas believed about life in the North? Was he correct? What does he find about life in the North? How are the wharves in New Bedford different than those in Baltimore? What conditions did he find for colored people? What does Frederick discover about prejudice against color in New Bedford? How does Douglas make a living when he can't find work as a caulker? How does Douglas become known as an anti-slavery? How does Douglas become known to the anti-slavery world? Why is Douglas at first reluctant to speak out against slavery? So there's a lot of really good information here, and just by those questions, it is going to be a really awesome chapter. So get comfortable, and we'll begin. Chapter 11. I now come to that part of my life during which I planned and finally succeeded in making my escape from slavery. But before narrating any of the peculiar circumstances, I deem it proper to make it known my intention not to state all the facts connected with the transaction. My reasons for pursuing this course may be understood from the following. First, were I to give a minute statement of all the facts, it is not only not possible, but quite probable that others would thereby be involved in the most embarrassing difficulties. Secondly, such a statement would most undoubtedly induce greater vigilance on the part of slaveholders than has existed here to be among them, which could, of course, be means of guarding a door whereby some dear brother bondsman might escape his galling chains. I deeply regret the necessity that impels me to suppress anything of importance connected with my experience in slavery. It would afford me great pleasure indeed, as well as materially add to the interest of my narrative, were I at liberty to gratify a curiosity, which I know exists in the minds of many, by an accurate statement of all the facts pertaining to my most fortunate escape. But I must deprive myself of this pleasure, and the curious of the gratification which such a statement would afford. I would allow myself to suffer under the greatest imputations which evil-minded men might suggest, rather than exculpate myself, and thereby run the hazard of closing the slightest avenue by which a brother slave might clear himself in the chains and fetters of slavery. I've never approved of the very public manner in which some of our Western friends have conducted that they call the Underground Railroad, but which I think, by their own declarations, has been made most emphatically the Upperground Railroad. I honor those good men and women for their noble daring, and applaud them for willingly subjecting themselves to bloody persecution by openly avowing their participation in the escape of slaves. I, however, can see very little good resulting from such a course, either to themselves or the slaves escaping, while upon the other hand I see and feel assured that those often declarations are a positive evil to the slaves remaining, who are seeking to escape. They do nothing toward enlightening the slave, whilst they do much toward enlightening the master. They stimulate him to greater watchfulness, and enhance his power to capture his slave. We owe something to the slaves south of the line, as well as to those north of it, and in aiding the latter on their way to freedom, we should be careful to do nothing which would be likely to hinder the former from escaping from slavery. I would keep the merciless slaveholder profoundly ignorant of the means of flight adopted by the slave. I would leave him to imagine himself surrounded by myriads of invisible tormentors, ever ready to snatch from his infernal grasp his trembling prey. Let him be left to feel this way in the dark. Let darkness commensurate with his crime hover over him, and let him feel that, at every step he takes in pursuit of the flying bondsman, he is running the frightful risk of having his hot brains dashed out by an invisible agency. Let us render the tyrant no aid. Let us not hold the light by which he can trace the footprints of our flying brother. But enough of this. I will now proceed of the statement of those facts connected with my escape, for which I am alone responsible, and for which no one can be made to suffer but myself. In the early part of the year 1838, I became quite restless. I could see no reason why I should, at the end of each week, pour the reward of my toil into the purse of my master. When I carried to him my weekly wages, he would, after counting the money, look at me in the face with a robber-like fierceness and ask, "Is this all?" He was satisfied with nothing less than the last cent. He would, however, when I made him $6, sometimes give me 6 cents, to encourage me. It had the opposite effect. I regarded it as a sort of admission of my right to the whole. The fact that he gave me any part of my wages was proof, to my mind, that he believed me entitled to the whole of them. I always felt worse for having received anything, for I feared that the giving me a few cents would ease his conscience, and make him feel himself to be a pretty honorable sort of robber. My discontent grew upon me. I was ever on the lookout for means of escape, and finding no direct means, I determined to try to hire my time with the view of getting money with which to make my escape. In the spring of 1838, when Master Thomas came to Baltimore to purchase his spring goods, I got an opportunity and applied to him to allow me to hire my time. He unhesitatingly refused my request and told me this was another stratagem by which to escape. He told me I could go nowhere but that he could get me, and that, in the event of my running away, he should spare no pains in his efforts to catch me. He exhorted me to content myself and be obedient. He told me if I would be happy, I must lay out no plans for the future. He said if I behaved myself properly, he would take care of me. Indeed, he advised me to complete thoughtlessness of the future, and taught me to depend solely upon him for happiness. He seemed to see fully the pressing necessity of setting aside my intellectual nature in order to contentment with slavery. But in spite of him, and even in spite of myself, I continued to think, and to think about the injustice of my enslavement and the means of escape. About 2 months after this, I applied to Master Hugh for the privilege of hiring my time. He was not acquainted with the fact that I had applied to Master Thomas, and had been refused. He too, at first, seemed disposed to refuse, but after some reflections, he granted me the privilege, and proposed the following terms. I was to be allowed at all my time, make all contracts with those with whom I worked, and find my own employment, and in return for this liberty, I was to pay him $3 at the end of each week, find myself in caulking tools, and in board and clothing. My board was $2.50 per week. This, with the wear and tear of clothing and caulking tools, made my regular expenses about $6 per week. This amount I was compelled to make up, or relinquish the privilege of hiring my time. Rain or shine, work or no work, at the end of each week, the money must be forthcoming, or I must give up my privilege. This arrangement, it will be perceived, was decidedly in my master's favor. It relieved him of all need of looking after me. His money was sure. He received all the benefits of slaveholding, without its evils, while I endured all the evils of a slave, and suffered all the care and anxiety of a freeman. I found it a hard bargain. But, hard as it was, I thought it better than the old mode of getting along. It was a step toward freedom to be allowed to bear the responsibilities of a freeman, and I was determined to hold on upon it. I bent myself to the work of making money. I was ready to work at night as well as day, and by the most untiring perseverance and industry, I made enough to meet my expenses, and lay up a little money every week. I went on thus from May until August. Master Hugh then refused to allow me to hire my time longer. The ground for his refusal was a failure on my part one Saturday night to pay him for my week's time. This failure was occasioned by my attending a camp meeting about 10 miles from Baltimore. During the week, I had entered into an engagement with a number of young friends to start from Baltimore to the camp ground early Saturday evening, and being detained by my employer, I was unable to get down to Master Hugh without disappointing the company. I knew that Master Hugh was in no special need of the money that night. I therefore decided to go to camp meeting, and upon my return pay him the $3. I stayed at the camp meeting only one day longer than I intended when I left, but as soon as I returned, I called upon him to pay him what he considered his due. I found him very angry. He could scarce restrain his wrath. He said he had a great mind to give me a severe whipping. He wished to know how I dared to go out in the city without asking his permission. I told him I hired my time, and while I paid him the price which he asked for it, I did not know that I was bound to ask him when and where I should go. This reply troubled him, and after reflecting a few moments, he turned to me and said I should hire my time no longer, and that the next thing he should know of, I would be running away. Upon the same plea, he told me to bring my tools and clothing home forthwith. I did so, but instead of seeking work, as I had been accustomed to do previously, I spent the whole week without the performance of a single stroke of work. I did this in retaliation. Saturday night, he called upon me as usual for my week's wages. I told him I had no wages. I had done no work that week. We were upon the point of coming to blows. He raved, and swore his determination to get hold of me. I did not allow myself a single word, but was resolved that if he laid the weight of his hand upon me, it should be blow for blow. He did not strike me, but told me he would find me in consultant employment in future. I thought the matter over during the next day. Sunday, and finally resolved upon the 3rd day of September, is the day upon which I would make a second attempt to secure my freedom. I now had 3 weeks during which to prepare for my journey. Early on Monday morning, before Master Hugh had time to make any engagement for me, I went out and got employment of Mr. Butler at a shipyard, near the drawbridge upon what is called the city block, thus making it unnecessary for him to seek employment for me. At the end of the week, I brought him between $8 and $9. He seemed very well pleased, and asked me why I did not do the same the week before. He little knew what my plans were. My object in working steadily was to remove any suspicion he might entertain of my intent to run away, and in this I succeeded admirably. I suppose he thought I was never better satisfied with my condition than at the very time during which I was planning my escape. The second week passed, and again I carried him my full wages, and so well pleased was he that he gave me 25 cents, quite a large sum for a slaveholder to give a slave, and bade me to make a good use of it. I told him I would. Things went on without very smoothly indeed, but wherein there was trouble. It is impossible for me to describe my feelings at the time of my contemplated start drew near. I had a number of warm-hearted friends in Baltimore, friends that I loved almost as I did my life, and the thought of being separated from them forever was painful beyond expression. It is my opinion that thousands would escape from slavery, who now remain but for the strong cords of affection that bind them to their friends. The thought of leaving my friends was decidedly the most painful thought which I had to contend. The love of them was my tender point, and shook my decision more than all things else. Besides the pain of separation, the dread and apprehension of a failure exceeded what I had experienced as my first attempt. The appalling defeat I then sustained returned to torment me. I felt assured that, if I failed in this attempt, my case would be a hopeless one, for it would seat my fate as a slave forever. I could not hope to get off with anything less than the severest punishment, and being placed beyond the means of escape, it required no very vivid imagination to depict the most frightful scenes through which I should have to pass in case I failed. The wretchedness of slavery, and the blessedness of freedom, were perpetually before me. It was life and death with me. But I remained firm, and according to my resolution, on the 3rd day of September, 1838, I left my chains and succeeded in reaching New York without the slightest interruption of any kind. How I did so, what means I adopted, what direction I traveled, and by what mode of conveyance, I must leave unexplained for the reasons I have mentioned before. I have been frequently asked how I felt when I found myself in a free state. I have never been able to answer the question with any satisfaction to myself. It was a moment of the highest excitement I have ever experienced. I suppose I felt as one may imagine the unarmed mariner to feel when he is rescued by a friendly man of war from the pursuit of a pirate. In writing to a dear friend, immediately after my arrival in New York, I said I felt like one who had escaped a den of hungry lions. This state of mind, however, very soon subsided, and I was again seized with a feeling of great insecurity and loneliness. I was yet liable to be taken back and subjected to all the tortures of slavery, and this itself was enough to damp the ardor of my enthusiasm. But the loneliness overcame me. There I was in the midst of thousands, and yet a perfect stranger, without a home and without friends, in the midst of thousands of my own brethren, children of a common Father, and yet I dared not to unfold to any of them my sad condition. I was afraid to speak to any one, for fear of speaking to the wrong one, and thereby falling into the hands of money-loving kidnappers, whose business it was to lie in wait for the paying fugitive, as the ferocious beasts of the forest lie in wait to their prey. The motto which I adopted when I started from slavery was this: trust no man. I saw in every white man an enemy, and in almost every colored man cause for distrust. It was a most painful situation, and to understand it one must needs experience it, or imagine himself in a similar circumstance. Let him be a fugitive slave in a strange land, a land given up to be the hunting ground for slaveholders, whose inhabitants are legalized kidnappers, where he is every moment subjected to the terrible liability of being seized upon by his fellowmen, as the hideous crocodile seizes upon his prey. Say, let him place himself in my situation, without home or friends, without money or credit, wanting shelter and no one to give it, wanting bread and no money to buy it, and at the same time let him feel that he is pursued by merciless men hunters, and in total darkness as to what to do, where to go, or what to stay, or where to stay, perfectly helpless, both as to the means of defense and means of escape, in the midst of plenty, yet suffering, in the terrible gnawings of hunger, in the midst of houses, yet having no home, among fellow men, yet feeling as if in the midst of wild beasts, whose greediness to swallow up the trembling and half-famished fugitive is only equalled by that which the monsters of the deep swallow up the helpless fish upon which they subsist. I say let him be placed in this most trying situation, the situation in which I was placed. Then, and not until then, will he fully appreciate the hardships of, and know how to sympathize with, the toil-worn and whip-scarred fugitive slave. Thank heaven, I remained but a short time in this distressed situation. I was relieved by it by a humane hand of Mr. David Ruggles, whose vigilance, kindness, and perseverance I shall never forget. I am glad of an opportunity to express, as far as words can, the love and gratitude I bear him. Mr. Ruggles is now afflicted with blindness, and is himself in need of the same kind offices which he was once so forward in the performance toward others. I have been in New York but a few days, when Mr. Ruggles sought me out, and very kindly took me to his boarding house at the corner of Church and Lesbernard streets. Mr. Ruggles was then very deeply engaged with the memorable Darg case, as well as attending to a number of other fugitive slaves, devising ways and means for their successful escape. And though watched and hemmed in on almost every side, he seemed to be more than a match for his enemies. Very soon after I went to Mr. Ruggles, he wished to know of me where I wanted to go, as he deemed it unsafe for me to remain in New York. I told him I was a caulker, and should like to go where I could get work. I thought of going to Canada, but he decided against it, and in favor of me going to New Bedford, thinking I should be able to get work there at my trade, for at this time Ahna, my intended wife, came on, for I wrote to her immediately after my arrival at New York, notwithstanding my homeless, houseless, and helpless condition, informing her of my successful flight and wishing her to come on forthwith. And a few days after her arrival, Mr. Ruggles called in the Reverend J.W.C. Pennington, who, in the presence of Mr. Ruggles, Mrs. Michaels, and 2 or 3 others, performed the marriage ceremony, and gave us a certificate, of which the following is an exact copy. This I may certify that I joined together in holy matrimony Frederick Johnson and Anna Murray as man and wife in the presence of Mr. David Ruggles and Mrs. Michaels. Upon receiving this certificate and a $5 bill from Mr. Ruggles, I shouldered one part of our baggage and Anna took up the other, and we set out forthwith to take passage on board of the steamboat John W. Richmond for Newport. On our way to Bedford, Mr. Ruggles gave me a letter to Mr. Shaw of Newport, and told me, in case my money did not serve me to New Bedford, to stop in Newport and obtain further assistance. But upon our arrival at Newport, they were so anxious to get to a place of safety that, notwithstanding we lacked the necessary money to pay our fare, we decided to take seats in the stage and promised to pay when we got to New Bedford. We were encouraged to do this by 2 excellent gentlemen, residents in New Bedford, whose names I afterward ascertained to be Joseph Ricketson and William C. Tabor. They seemed at once to understand our circumstances, and gave each of us assurance of their friendliness as to put us fully at ease in their presence. It was good indeed to meet with such friends at such a time. Upon reaching New Bedford, we were directed to the house of Mr. Nathan Johnson, by whom we were kindly received and hospitably provided for. Both Mr. and Mrs. Johnson took a deep and lively interest in our welfare. They proved themselves quite worthy of the name of abolitionists. When the stage driver found us unable to pay our fare, he held on upon our baggage as a security of the debt. I had but mentioned of the fact to Mr. Johnson, and he forthwith advanced the money. We have now begun to feel a degree of safety, and to prepare ourselves for the duties and responsibilities of a life of freedom. On the morning after our arrival at New Bedford, while at the breakfast table, the question arose as to what name I should be called by. The name given me by my mother was Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. I, however, had dispensed with the 2 middle names long before I left Maryland, so that I was generally known by the name of Frederick Bailey. I started from Baltimore, bearing the name of Stanley. When I got to New York, I again changed my name to Frederick Johnson, and thought that would be the last change. But when I got to New Bedford, I found it necessary again to change my name. The reasons of this necessity was there were so many Johnsons in New Bedford, it was already quite difficult to distinguish between them. I gave Mr. Johnson the privilege of choosing me a name, but told him he must not take it from me the name of Frederick. I must hold on to that, to preserve a sense of my identity. Mr. Johnson had just been reading The Lady of the Lake, and at once suggested that my name be Douglas. From that time until now, I have been called Frederick Douglas, and as I am more widely known by that name than either of the others, I shall continue to use it as my own. I was quite disappointed at the general appearance of things in New Bedford. The impression of which I had received respecting the character and the condition of the people of the North, I found to be similarly erroneous. I had very strangely supposed, while in slavery, that a few comforts, and scarcity of any luxuries, of life were enjoyed at the North, compared with what we enjoyed by the slaveholders of the South. I probably came to this conclusion from the fact that Northern people owned no slaves. I suppose that they were upon a level with the non-slaving population of the South. I knew they were exceedingly poor, and I had been accustomed to regard their poverty as the necessary consequence of their being non-slaveholders. I had somehow imbibed the opinion that, in the absence of slaves, there could be no wealth, and in very little refinement. And upon coming to the North, I expected to meet with a rough, hard-handed, and uncultivated population, living like the most Spartan-like simplicity, knowing nothing of the ease, luxury, pomp, and grandeur of Southern slaveholders. Such being my conjectures, any one acquainted with the appearance of New Bedford may very readily infer how palpably I must have seen my mistake, which means it was a really rich area. In the afternoon of the day which I reached New Bedford, I visited the wharves to take a view of the shipping. Here I found myself surrounded with the strongest proof of wealth. Lying at the wharves and riding in the stream, I saw many ships of the finest model, in the best order, and of the largest size. Upon the right and left I was walled in by granite warehouses of the widest dimensions, stowed to their utmost capacity with the necessaries and comforts of life. Added to this, almost everybody seemed to be at work, but noiselessly so, compared with what I'd been accustomed to in Baltimore. There were no loud songs heard from those engaged in loads and unloading of ships. I heard no deep oaths or horrid curses on the laborer. I saw no whippings of men, but all seemed to go smoothly on. Every man appeared to understand his work, and went at it with a sober yet cheerful earnestness, which betokened the great interest to which he felt he was doing, as well as a sense of his own dignity as a man. To me this looked exceedingly strange. From the wharves I strolled around, and all over the town, gazed with wonder and admiration at the splendid churches, beautiful dwellings, and finely cultivated gardens, evincing an amount of wealth, comfort, taste, and refinement as I had never seen in any part of slaveholding Maryland. Everything looked clean, new, and beautiful. I saw few or no dilapidated houses, with poverty-stricken inmates, no half-naked children and barefooted women, such as I had been accustomed to see in Hillsborough, Easton, St. Michael's, and Baltimore. The people looked more able, stronger, healthier, and happier than those of Maryland. I was for once made glad by a view of extreme wealth, without being saddened by seeing extreme poverty. But the most astonishing, as well as the most interesting thing to me, was the condition of the colored people, a great many of whom, like myself, had escaped thither as a refuge from the hunters of men. I found many who had not been 7 years out of their chains, living in finer houses, and evidently enjoying more of the comforts of life than the average slaveholder in Maryland. I will venture to assert that my friend, Mr. Nathan Johnson, of whom I can say with a grateful heart, I was hungry, and he gave me meat. I was thirsty, and he gave me a drink. I was a stranger, and he took me in. Lived in a neater house, dined at a better table, took, paid for, and read more newspapers, better understood the moral, religious, and political character of the nation than 9/10 of the slaveholders in Talbot County, Maryland. Yet Mr. Johnson was a working man. His hands were hardened by toil, and not his alone, but those also of Mrs. Johnson. I found the colored people much more spirited than I supposed they would be. I found among them a determination to protect each other from the bloodthirsty kidnapper at all hazards. Soon after my arrival, I was told of a circumstance which illustrated their spirit. A colored man and a fugitive slave were on unfriendly terms. The former was heard to threaten the latter with informing his master of his whereabouts. Straightway, a meeting was called among the colored people, under the stereotyped notice, "Business of importance." The betrayer was invited to attend. The people came to an appointed hour, and organized the meeting by appointing a very religious old gentleman as president, who I believe made a prayer, after which he addressed the meeting as follows: "Friends, we have got him here, and I would recommend that you young men just take him out the door and kill him." With this, a number of them bolted at him, but they were intercepted by some more timid than themselves, and the betrayer escaped their vengeance, and has not been seen in New Bedford since. I believe there has been no more such threats, and there should be hereafter. I doubt not that death would be the consequence. I found employment the third day after my arrival in stowing a sloop with a load of oil. It was new, dirty, and hard work for me, but I went at it with a glad heart and a willing hand. I was now my own master. I was a happy moment of rapture which can be understood only by those who have been slaves. It was the first work, the reward of which was to be entirely my own. There was no Master Hugh standing ready, the moment I earned the money, to rob me of it. I worked that day with a pleasure I have never before experienced. I was at work for myself, a newly married wife. It was to me the starting point of a new existence. When I got through with that job, I went in pursuit of a job caulking. Such was the strength of prejudice against color among the white caulkers that they refused to work with me, and of course I could get no employment. Finding my trade of no immediate benefit, I threw off my caulking habiliments and prepared myself to do any kind of work I could get to do. Mr. Johnson kindly let me have his wood horse and saw, and I very soon found myself a plenty of work. There was no work too hard, none too dirty. I was ready to saw wood, shovel coal, carry the hod, sweep the chimney, or roll oil casks, all of which I did for nearly 3 years in New Bedford, before I became known to the anti-slavery world. In about 4 months after I went to New Bedford, there came a young man to me and inquired if I did not wish to take the Liberator. I told him I did, but just having made my escape from slavery, I remarked that I was unable to pay for it then. However, I finally became a subscriber to it. The paper came, and I read it from week to week with such feelings that it would be quite idle for me to attempt to describe. The paper became my meat and my drink. My soul was set all on fire. Its sympathy for my brethren in bonds, its scathing denunciations of slaveholders, its faithful exposure of slavery, and its powerful attacks upon the upholders of the institution, sent a thrill of joy through my soul, such I have never before felt. I had not been long a reader of the Liberator before I got a pretty correct idea of the principles, measures, and spirit of the anti-slavery reform. I took right hold of the cause. I could do but little, but what I could, I did, with a joyful heart, and never felt happier than when in an anti-slavery meeting. I seldom had much to say at the meetings, because what I wanted to say was so much better by others, was said so much better by others. But while attending an anti-slavery convention at Nantucket on the 11th of August, 1841, I felt strongly moved to speak, and was at the same time much urged to do so by Mr. William C. Coffin, a gentleman who had heard me speak in the colored people's meetings at New Bedford. It was a severe cross, and I took it up reluctantly. And the truth was, I felt myself a slave, and the idea of speaking to white people weighed me down. I spoke but a few moments, when I felt a degree of freedom, and said what I desired with considerable ease. From that time until now, I have been engaged in pleading the cause of my brethren. With what success and with what devotion, I leave those acquainted with my labors to decide. Well, and that is the end of chapter 11. After that, we have the appendix, which I will read to you next. All right, so chapter 11. Hold on. So, for what reasons does Frederick tell us that he cannot relate the means of his escape? Well, because he doesn't want the slaveholders to know how uh, the slaves were escaping. So that way it might not deter another slave from trying to escape. That's the first reason. And then the second reason is because he says that he doesn't want he wants the slave master to be constantly on edge and try to figure out how they're going to escape. He wants escape. He wants the slave masters to be living in fear of that. And he doesn't want to take any of that away. Why does he not approve of the Underground Railroad? Well, for two things. He said that he didn't like it because it's not really underground. It is an above ground railroad, and it doesn't necessarily set up the slave for what they need to get to freedom. I could be wrong. I'm going to double check that, but from when I read it, that's what I got out of it. So, what does Mr. Hugh do to attempt to encourage Frederick to continue to earn money? What effect does this encouragement have? So, I found that really interesting. He would give Frederick a little bit of money every so often. And that was to encourage him to keep working because he could still potentially get a portion of his wages, even though like it was like 6 cents. So like if he made $6, getting 6 cents of it, that's not a lot of money. And yet, Mr. Hugh would do that to be like, oh, I gave you something, keep working, and no. And so that made Douglas, excuse me, he wasn't known as Douglas at that point. That makes Frederick angry because he feels that he's entitled to all of it because he earned it and he's right. And he, by getting that little bit, it is for him acknowledging that he was entitled to some of his money to begin with. And the only reason he's not getting it is because of slavery. And his master knows it too. And that makes Frederick really angry. So, what does Frederick ask of Master Thomas? And what is he told? So, I keep going back between Master Thomas and Master Hugh, and I talked about that. I don't know if you guys remember, but they were brothers. And so, technically, Frederick is owned by both of them. And so he went first to Master Thomas to ask if he could earn his wages. So Master Thomas would no longer have to take care of him, give him money, or excuse me, not money, give him food, shelter, anything like that. But Frederick could go out and get his own employment. It wouldn't have to be set up by his master. And then he would still be responsible for, his rent, so to speak. So he would need to pay for his own board, his own food, and then still pay. It came out to like half his wages a week to his slave master purely because he was a slave. And Master Thomas said no because he knew that that wouldn't be enough for Frederick and it would be a reason for Frederick to escape. And he told him that. Okay, so what arrangement does Frederick make with Mr. Hugh? And why is that arrangement to Mr. Hugh's advantage? So why does Frederick agree to it? So what I just said, that deal I just said, is what Frederick makes with Mr. Hugh. So he pays him $3 a week for nothing, purely because he's the slave master. And then Frederick is responsible for his own food, his tools, his room and board, and anything else he wants to save. And he also has the responsibility of going out, finding his own employment. So obviously it works out in the benefit of Master Hugh because he gets paid $3 a week for which he did nothing. And now he no longer has to give food or a place to stay to Frederick. But Frederick agrees to it because he's like, it's closer to freedom. Even if it's more work, it's still closer to where he wanted to go. And so to him, it was worth it. Alright. What does Mr. Hugh do when he discovers that Frederick has left town to find work? Mr. Hugh tells him that he can't work for his wages anymore. So if you remember, Frederick went away and stayed an extra night. And he knew that his slave master didn't need the $3 by Friday, so he came back Saturday and gave him the $3. And Mr. Hugh gets really angry and comes to the same conclusion that his brother did, that Frederick will eventually run away and he can't be able to do his own wages anymore because he doesn't want Frederick to have any kind of a freedom. And by being able to come and go as he pleased to a different area, it was too much freedom for Master Hugh. So, why does Frederick decide to work hard despite the dissolution of their agreement? When and where? Oh, that's the next question. So, Frederick decides to work hard for the next 3 weeks, even after their agreement um, was no more, because Frederick decided he was going to run away. And he wanted to give Master Hugh no opportunity to think for a moment that he was going to run away. So, to do that, he gave him every cent, he complied with everything, and he said nothing that would make him think that he was unhappy. So, when and where does Frederick run away? He runs away first to New York. And he runs away in September, 3 weeks after the dissolution of his agreement with Master Hugh. And he feels really lonely, which is the next question, because he feels like he can't talk to anybody. He is so afraid of being caught and found out. Because I addressed this in the book, but, when we were reading, if he got caught, because this was his second escape, he wouldn't get a third. So it was literally this or nothing. And he was afraid of being kidnapped and sent back, where he would have the harshest of punishments. And if that happened, then, he would never have an opportunity again. And because he didn't feel he could trust anybody, because for obvious reasons, he didn't trust any white person. They were the enemy. And he couldn't trust any black people because if something happened, they might give him up. So, yeah, he felt entirely by himself. And so the next question, who helps Frederick in New York? And how? How is it possible for Frederick and Ahna to marry? Why is their marriage such an important event? Okay, so he felt that he was completely by himself. And he got sought out by Mr. Ruggles, who is the person who helped him. He was an abolitionist, and he would help slaves get to freedom. So he decides to help him get to New Bedford, which is where he wants to go. And and he actually calls in I guess not a priest, but a minister. There we go. There's the word. To marry Frederick and Ahna. And that was really important because, I mean, uh, he called Ahna to be with him because he was a slave and she wasn't. And by Mr. Ruggles doing that, they were able to get married. So why does Mr. Ruggles suggest that Frederick not stay in New York and go to New Bedford, Massachusetts? Well, because Frederick wanted to get work, and it also wasn't safe for him to stay in New York. Um, Frederick wanted to do work as a caulker, and so Mr. Ruggles suggested that he go to um, New Bedford to do that. So who helps Frederick and Ahna in New Bedford? And what does he do for them? Okay, so the person who helps him when he gets to New Bedford is Mr. Johnson. And Mr. Johnson, basically, when Frederick gets to town, he helps him and Ahna set up everything. He gave them a place to stay, food to eat, helped him get situated in a job, and really tried to help him get set up so he could succeed where he was at. And so why did Frederick change his name so many times? And who chooses Douglas? And why? Well, this goes back to the previous question. Mr. Johnson chooses the name Douglas. And he does it because he was reading a book. And he wanted the name Douglas based on one of the characters in the book. So, why did Frederick change his last name to Douglas? Well, he changed it so many times. He took out I guess he had two middle names, and he took those out. And he changed his name so many times to avoid detection and getting caught. So, he was known at different things. When he got married, his last name was Bailey, and he thought that was going to be I think it was Bailey. 99% positive it was Bailey. And he thought that was going to be the last change. But he felt the need to change it again to Johnson once he got to New Bedford. Or excuse me, change it to Douglas when he got to New Bedford. Because there were so many Johnsons, it was hard to keep track of everything. Yeah. And so he gets his name changed. So what conditions... Oh, wait, wrong question. What had Douglas believed about life in the North? Was he correct? What does he find about life in the North? So Douglas believed that people in the North were a lot poorer because they didn't have slaves. And in the South, when you didn't have slaves, you were a lot poorer than people who were on plantations. So he imagined in a place that was completely free, everyone was going to be a lot poorer. And he was very wrong. He went to an area that was prospering. They had a decent bit of money, and he said people there, black people who used to be slaves, after a few years' time, were wealthier than some of the plantation owners he had lived in and seen in Maryland, which is crazy. He had a really hard time believing that. And so he had opportunity there if he worked hard. So that goes, I accidentally answered the next question, which was what conditions did he find for colored people? He was able to, if he worked hard, he would be able to provide a really good life for himself and for his family. So how does Douglas make a living when he can't find work as a caulker? Well, because if you remember, whites didn't want to work next to blacks who were caulking. There was a lot of racism right there. And so he couldn't get hired as a caulker. So he decides to do basically anything with his hands that he can. And he did that kind of work when he was in Maryland. So Mr. Johnson gives him a sawhorse and a saw, so he could do whatever needed to be done. Cutting wood, scooping coal, anything like that. Any like really manual labor. So yeah, that's what he does. And while he was doing that, this is a segue to the next question. How does Douglas become known to the anti-slavery world? Well, he got a paper. The paper, I believe, was called the Libertarian. Give me a sec. All right, half wrong. It was called the Liberator. All right. So he gets that paper, and in it, it's so many of the ideas that Douglas has felt in his heart, and it's shared by a collective group of people that slavery is wrong, and ousting, the guise of it and what the slave masters were doing. And Frederick was so happy and excited. He wanted to give. He didn't have much to give, but he wanted to do whatever he could to be a part of it, to continue this kind of thinking, because it could change things. And that's what he does. He doesn't say a lot when he starts going to these meetings, and then he becomes well known for at a convention for speaking up, and then he continued to speak up and continued to be a powerful voice. So why was Douglas at first, which is the last question, why is he at first reluctant to speak out against slavery? Well, this was huge, because he felt that he was still a slave, even though he had his freedom. See, because at these anti-slavery rallies, white people were there. And Douglas didn't feel comfortable speaking to white people because it weighed his spirit down and made him feel like because they were there that he was still a slave. And so at this one moment in this convention, he had the strength and the courage to face that head on and to drop that cross. He calls it a cross, and it makes sense. And he says what he feels. And then from that moment, from when he put that down, he no longer, I don't know if he never felt like a slave again, but he no longer let that stop him from speaking. And so then he started to really speak out, and he continued to do so. So that is the end of that chapter. I will read to you the appendix, and there's some poems at the end, and I think it's really important, like I said, with everything going on, we need to listen. I know that, for the age group of our kids and everything, and it can be a hard read for anybody. It can be a really hard read, but it's really important, and we need to understand the history so that we can do something to prevent it from happening in the future. So that is the end of chapter 11. I hope you guys are doing well and you stay safe. Again, if you have any questions on anything or want to know more about anything that we read, please just let me know. All right. Have a great day, guys. Bye.